thinking particularly about this time, both the overlapping, the multiple crises, really the emergencies of pandemic, of really vitriol in our public sphere, and of course, most recently the wildfires. There's a lot to grapple with, and sometimes there's a heaviness that I feel. There are things that give me kind of positive intrinsic motivation, and then there are things that really help me when mornings are tough or moments are tough. So for me, I kind of have, I think I was born with a little bit of moral righteousness. Even as a little girl, I remember spotting things that I didn't think were right and speaking up. So the way that ties into my life, I have made some decisions in my life that have put me in the path of the most relevant work I can think of. We make lots of decisions about the type of work we do. Sometimes it's a combination of necessity, sometimes a combination of luck. And for me, I was lucky and privileged to get to go to college, to have time to really contemplate. But it was at UC Berkeley that I decided to come back and farm. And it was in the conjunction of, I studied gender and women's studies. So I was steeped in thinking about power, both historically and contemporaneously. And then I also took an environmental studies class, which just completely changed my life. So my entry into farming was pretty defiant. I knew going into farming, less than 12% of all farmers are women identified. In terms of landowning farmers, people of color are by far in the minority. And I don't even know if there are statistics kept on queer farmers. I know there's some of us, but not a lot. So those motivations of really making my life something relevant, something courageous, that really motivates me, really day to day, especially when I'm tired as I age. And then on the flip side, the moments where it is really hard, it's felt very dark, especially in 2020. And so in those moments, what really inspires me, I keep thinking about, especially during this pandemic, I keep thinking about my ancestors, particularly in my Japanese American family, who survived through prison camp, American concentration camps during World War II. And I feel almost, I have no right to give up on my own power, because I am the recipient of the life that my ancestors gave me by surviving through horrendous circumstances. So they kind of give me a boost when I'm feeling pretty low. But also, I absolutely am grateful to my parents, especially growing up in a mixed race home. We talked about race and racism a lot. It wasn't a subject that was, that my parents were fearful of engaging with children. I mean, from an early age, there was never a time that I did not know my grandparents were imprisoned during World War II for only one reason, which is, well, maybe two: war hysteria combined with deep racism. And so because I knew that history, I knew from a very early age how imperfect our world could be. And I, for whatever reason, thought and continue to believe that I can make a difference, even if it's food and farming. I can't think of something more essential, because obviously we can't survive without food on a very short term as human beings. And then if we look on a global scale, food and farming, that is one of the places where we can actually reverse some of the damage that we've done, not only to the environment, but to people. So I think that the questions for me when I think about agriculture is like, how can we deconstruct this big monolith that we tend to think of things in monolithic form, right? How can we get nuanced? Because one of my rubs is I fundamentally can point to how the agricultural system is designed hand in hand with extractive capitalism, right? The industrial large-scale farming is designed to suck out all the life of soil, suck out all the labor from farm workers, and retain profits for a very few people. And while that is such, I also think one of the challenges is a lot of people involved in agriculture at every scale have a intention of doing good. So the problem then becomes, how do we get beyond the us versus them? And how do we really start teasing out and untangling exactly where we're going wrong? And hold people accountable for the damages that have historically been done, whether it's to the environment, water, soil, air, or also to people and the very damaging labor practices. I mean, we can think about the United States. The history of agriculture cannot be separated from colonialism, genocide of Native Americans, and slavery. I mean, that's how the American agriculture system was born. My initial take is there's multiple processes that have to happen in order for people to be seen and heard. Some of them are internal in that people who come from histories of trauma need space and resources to heal. And sometimes that looks like, you know, if we're talking about people of color or queer people of color, it means that we need spaces for ourselves that are safe, where we can support each other, find our own voices. So there's some of that kind of like internal work that needs to be done, but it needs to be resourced. It needs to be supported. And then the flip side is, so the question of how does one be seen and heard, it depends fundamentally on the other person, right? The person who how do you acknowledge someone else's humanity? It requires your presence as a counterpart. So it cannot be just up to young people, women, whomever is feeling unheard or unseen. It can't just be up to them to like, oh, they just need to get stronger. Like, that's not the answer, right? Like, there has to be a fundamental shift. It starts with neighbors sometimes. I mean, literally, I have neighbors who are very, on paper, our political affiliations are in deep conflict, but they're friends, and we, as a small farm, we borrow their forklifts in emergencies, and so, you know, there's a lot of more conversation to be had. But yeah, I do think when it is so hard to retain the open connection with another human being when you feel threatened by either what they're saying or what they're doing. But I think that like the catch-22 of that is for those of us who find ourselves often in positions of less power, we still have to keep that channel open. At least I think. I just don't know how else we can have common ground and have actual dialogue, even though the catch-22 of it is often I find myself in places where I literally don't feel heard or seen. But yet I need to continue to acknowledge the pain that a lot of people are speaking from, even when they're not seeing the pain that I'm talking about and that I want to address. Diversity itself is this invitation to practice beauty in living form. Just this spring, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, Secretary Karen Ross, our California State Secretary of Agriculture, she and her staff crafted a really, I read it as tremendously honest statement about the need to address racial violence and histories of literal oppression in agriculture in California. It was like finally an official acknowledgement. But I know a lot of people a lot of land-owning white farmers had a real problem with her statement, which is, it's so wild to me, and I wish I could sit more with people who have that response, because I fundamentally am confused about what about naming historic racism is threatening. I mean, there's just so many examples. I mean, even in my own family history, my great-grandparents immigrated from Japan in the early 1900s. And in 1913, the California state legislature passed the alien land laws, which prohibited Asian immigrants from owning land. So that means that, I mean, you have to really stop and think about that. Like, think about what that meant. That meant that if my great-grandparents had come from any other country other than somewhere designated as in Asia, they could have purchased a piece of the California dream. Mm-hmm. But instead, they were literally excluded for no other reason. I don't understand why acknowledging that history is so threatening, other than that people are so steeped in fear, and that they haven't done the spiritual work to realize that they're going to have to give up something, which is they have to give up feeling like they're not culpable. I think you're tapping into a real tender spot in the field of agriculture that I know is going to take a long time to reconcile. I think it's people who have traditionally held power that they did not earn based in historic, blatant patterns of injustice. They might see diversity, quote unquote, as a challenge, because it shakes the very norms that have given them the audacity of entitlement, right? So from their perspective, having diverse people around you, I think that's why it's challenging. But I don't find living in multitude challenging at all. I find it quite organic and quite the right way to do things. My dear friend Bryn Saito, who's a poet and professor at Fresno State, she and I co-founded Yonsei Memory Project a few years ago. And it really was born out of a convergence of our energies as artists and also as Yonsei. So Yonsei, just for anyone who doesn't know, is fourth generation Japanese American, which is our generation. So it means our great grandparents were born in Japan. And so we got we knew each other's children and had both gone off and gotten to study in different places and found ourselves reconnecting here in Fresno. And we felt a really deep calling and responsibility as Yonsei to add our energy to the continuation of our community memory and our history. So we started every year annually. There's a Day of Remembrance on February 19th, which recognizes the date in 1942 that President Roosevelt signed the executive order, which gave legal permission to the armed forces to forcibly remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast. So that Day of Remembrance has for decades been a kind of a day, a ritual day to remember our ancestors. So Bryn and I, we kind of made that the centerpiece of some of what we've done and decided to do what we call cultural organizing in Fresno. So we've done things like memory bus rides, where we stop at public and private memorial markers in Fresno and kind of unpack the meaning of the stories there through poetry, through dialogue, through facilitated arts experiences. So we've done stuff kind of like focused on Japanese American memory keeping, as we like to call it. And then we've also done really intentional work around building bridges with other communities who are facing, unfortunately, so similar manifestations of racism and xenophobia. We've worked with the Islamic Cultural Center of Fresno and building bridges between Japanese Americans and Muslim Americans. We've done lots of public programming where anyone is welcome. with the goal of sparking deeper understanding of Japanese American experiences as a gateway to exploring the civil liberties abuses that have happened in our contemporary, especially post 9/11 world. And then we've also done some storytelling training to equip people with the skills and support to be able to craft their own stories. I absolutely believe that storytelling is part of that. And I mean, I think about these moments in history where so to me, the power of storytelling is opening that channel of heart-to-heart connection between human and human. And we know, I can point to so many examples historically where a version of storytelling has completely changed the trajectory of people's lives and history. I mean, I think about, this year, 2020, and the story of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, right, which gave white women the right to vote, unfortunately not women of color, but one step towards progress. And the story about the Tennessee state legislature being the final state that would, right, because constitutional amendment needed 2/3 of the state houses to ratify. And one vote changed history. And if I understand correctly, it was a very junior member of the Tennessee state house. I'm not sure which if it was house or Senate, but the state legislator. He got a letter from his mother, and he changed his vote because of that letter. So there's countless examples of those moments, and all of the moments of our lives are not necessarily as consequential as that one moment, but you never know when that moment is going to be the consequential moment. So I don't think storytelling alone is we need all the tools we can muster, but I without a doubt, I have experienced the way in which the shape of your heart changes when you truly are present with someone else's grief, with someone else's hopes, with someone else's dreams. And I have felt it as a receiver of stories, and I also have felt it as a vessel for stories to flow through. A visit that I made a couple years ago to a desert space in Arizona. And so this place is in Gila River, Arizona, which is the sovereign land of the Gila River Indian community. And it was the historic place where my grandparents were imprisoned during World War II. The US government built barracks and a prison camp with barbed wire on land that wasn't even theirs. To add insult to injury, they without permission, built on Gila River Indian community land. So I have had the opportunity to visit there. Understandably, it's not open to the public. You have to ask permission from the tribe in order to visit, because one is their sovereign land, but secondly, it's a really sacred and serious place. So I have visited a couple times, and on one of the visits, I was there with my father, who has studied a lot and knows a lot about the layout of how the camps used to be. Now there's no barracks. It's open desert land. And so you have to kind of read the shapes of the weeds in order to see and imagine where the rows and rows of barracks were. And on one of our visits, we were just walking in silence in the desert and just kind of taking in the scene, trying to stay awake to the emotions of the place. And I noticed a heart made out of rocks, not too far from where my father and I were standing. And I was just totally baffled, like, whoa, like, what is this? The heart of this shape of a heart made from stones. What is that? So I asked my father, and he guessed that he thought that's where the honeymoon barrack was. And that moment just, it completely changed something in me, because I realized, despite being literally ripped away from homes. My family were forced to carry only suitcases to a desert where they literally didn't know how long they were going to be there. They had no concept of how long they would be second-class citizens. And yet, in the desolation of the desert, people still fell in love. And that really spoke to me, not in terms of a Pollyanna idea of it didn't make camp, the experience of concentration camp, okay. But what it meant was that my people, my ancestors, had enough soul energy and force to let themselves fall in love with each other in the darkest of times. And in my own family history, my Jichan and Bacha, my grandma and grandpa, they were teenagers in camp, and they met in camp. So even in my family, I don't know if I would exist had they not had the courage to say that they wanted to believe that they would be able to leave one day and be able to start a family. Juicy conversations about memory. One of the interesting things, we've talked a lot about memory, and in some cultures, so I think in dominant American culture, we tend to think of the past as behind us and the future as in front of us. We tend to be fairly youth-oriented, future-oriented kind of culture. And in other cultures, the future actually exists behind you, and the past is actually in front of you. So I just share that to say that I don't, we often toggle between how do we tend to the preservation impulses of telling our ancestors, we will not forget you. I mean, that is such a deep, my Bachan, she passed away just this year, and over again, I hope that she hears how deeply I will continue to remember her. And I hope she can rest knowing that I won't forget her life. So there's that type of incredible responsibility that we have to acknowledging ancestors who came before. And I think in so doing, I really fundamentally believe in meditation with ancestors. And when you stop and you pause and you contemplate and you try to bring yourself intimately into connection with people who have come before, the channel of wisdom that you can offer to the next generation is so much greater than anything. Me, Nikiko, I'm 34 years old, which is a relatively short lifespan in the history of the world, right? So who am I to think that I individually have wisdom to offer? I don't. It's through study. It's through companionship. And maybe this is how you feel about your work in philosophy, like getting to be companions with these great thinkers from before our lives, and then getting to be in movement and not be prescriptive. I think that is one of the greatest errors of elders. And now that I have more white hair, and I think I'm now solidly in the middle-aged category, I really try to caution myself against being prescriptive, but instead trying to offer all that I can to next generation, Gen Z, and generations who come, and also treat our young people have wisdom in youth that we no longer have. And so if we can manage to be porous to the temporality of memory, being both oriented towards the past and the future, I have thought, and it's not my thoughts, there are people who are much smarter in terms of policy and looking at the aggregate of agriculture in the globe and its ramifications. And so, but this is the story that I've learned and that I can share. So when we think about the formidable challenge of healing an entire global food system that is designed not to take care of the soil, water, air, nor the people who harvest the fields. It can feel pretty demoralizing, pretty impossible. Mm-hmm. And my answer to that is, while the stakes could not be higher and the challenges seem that they couldn't be larger, if we look at some of the answers that scientists have been offering for how we stall and then actually reverse climate change, many of those answers are in agriculture. Mm-hmm. There's a book called Drawdown. The author's name is escaping me. But this book, Drawdown, it highlights, I think it's the 50 most promising methods of actually drawing emissions, carbon emissions, down from the atmosphere, and thus not just stopping climate change, but actually reversing climate change. And out of the top 10, I think 8 of them are in agriculture. Wow. So when you think about that and you think about the potential, agriculture is a fundamental part of the answer. And what makes me so excited is that it's not only an answer in an ecological sense. What better metaphor and literal source of nourishment? I mean, like, we get to feed our way out of disaster if we can summon enough energy to change, especially the United States. We know President Trump withdrew our country from the Paris Accord. That is absolutely not the direction we desperately need to be going in. So while I am only in charge of farming with my father on 80 acres, and that might sound small, if I don't do my part, then these 80 acres won't be a healing force. We're organic, and we need to continue to grow and doing better for our stewardship. There's a new kind of realm that both borrows from old practices, and the new terminology is regenerative agriculture, which I'm very excited about. So on this little scale, I kind of like flipping the audacity, like, how dare I even consider giving up this spot, like of giving my body. I literally am committing my body for the rest of my life to doing everything I can to contributing my small part. And this is where I think that the cynicism that is very heavy in America right now is that we almost have forgotten some of the audacity of our country. This is why I love the musical Hamilton, because it reminds us of the audacity of the American Revolution to throw off a monarchy. And of course, the story of our democracy the promise is not yet fulfilled. But we can't give up on that audacity. We need to believe in the audacity that we can do good by each other and by the earth.